I still remember the first time I really understood how fragile everything out there on my land actually was, not in some poetic sense, but in a very real, very practical way. Like one day things just stop working and you don't get a warning, you just notice the silence where there used to be water. My place sits out in eastern Montana, wide open ranch country, nothing fancy, just me, my cattle, and about 180 acres of dry rolling land that only makes sense because of one thing: a spring-fed creek that cuts through it like a thin blue thread holding everything together. That creek isn't just scenery, it's survival. It's what keeps the pasture alive in the summer heat, and what keeps my herd from turning into something I can't manage. The rights to that water go back to 1952, old senior rights my grandfather fought to secure when the valley was still being mapped out by hand. And for as long as I owned the place, nobody ever questioned it. Not once, no disputes, no arguments, just the quiet understanding that upstream or downstream, that water had a history older than all of us. Then the people from Seattle showed up. I remember the first time I saw their truck on the county road, clean, expensive, the kind of vehicle that doesn't belong in cattle country unless it's lost or intentional. They were a couple, Daniel and Marissa Hale, bought the upstream parcel that had been empty for years, said they wanted to turn it into a regenerative retreat, something about off-grid living and restoring natural ecosystems. And honestly, at first I didn't think much of it, because out here people come and go with big ideas all the time, and most of them fade once the wind and dust get real. I met Daniel once near the fence line where our properties almost touch. He was friendly in that rehearsed kind of way. Asked about the land, the cattle, nodded a lot when I explained the creek, and made sure to say he respected historic water rights. I remember thinking that was a good sign, like maybe this would be one of the rare cases where neighbors just stayed out of each other's way. But something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me, like he was agreeing with words but not with meaning, and I didn't know why I felt that until later. The first real change came quietly, not all at once, just the creek running a little lower than usual, nothing dramatic enough to alarm you immediately, just enough that you start checking it more often than you used to, like a habit you didn't have before. I told myself it was seasonal, maybe upstream snowpack was lighter this year, maybe I was overthinking it. Ranchers do that sometimes when things matter too much. But then the cattle started moving differently, lingering around the troughs longer, drinking deeper, and that's when I knew something was off. I hiked upstream one morning just after sunrise, boots still wet from dew. And the closer I got to the Hale property, the more the sound of water faded until it was almost gone, replaced by this strange stillness that didn't belong in a living creek. I walked through the tree line, and that's when I saw it, a massive earthen dam built right across the natural flow, packed soil and timber stacked like someone had decided to rewrite geography with machinery, and behind it a rising artificial pond stretching wider every day, holding back everything that should have been moving through my land. For a moment, I just stood there, not even angry yet, just trying to process the fact that someone could look at a shared watershed and decide they owned the concept of it. By the time I reached their house, I was already done being patient. Daniel came out onto the deck like he was expecting me, coffee in hand, calm like nothing was wrong, and I told him straight, "You are blocking my water. That creek runs through my ranch, and you don't have the right to hold it back like this." He leaned on the railing, looked past me toward the trees, and said something I still remember word for word. He said it's still flowing, just redistributed. The pond needs time to stabilize its ecosystem, like he was explaining a design choice instead of admitting he had cut off a lifeline. I told him this isn't a design project. This is law. Senior water rights don't care about your ecosystem plans. And that's when he smiled a little, not friendly, more like amused, and said his consultant told him they were well within reasonable use guidelines. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. This was going to become something heavier. I drove straight to town that afternoon, dust still on my boots, and went to see Harold Vance, the county watermaster, a man who has probably forgotten more about irrigation law than most people will ever know. And when I laid it all out for him, he didn't even hesitate. He just pulled the old basin maps, traced the creek, checked the registry, and nodded slowly like he had seen this exact kind of situation more times than he liked. He said my 1952 senior rights absolutely controlled that flow, no exceptions, no interpretations, and that what the Hales had done upstream was an impairment, plain and simple. The next morning, he sent a field inspector out, and by noon they had measured the reduction, almost 70% drop in downstream flow, which in dry country like this is not just illegal, it's dangerous. A violation notice was issued requiring immediate removal of the dam within 14 days. I remember feeling a small relief that night, thinking maybe this would correct itself quickly. Maybe Daniel just didn't understand the seriousness of it yet. I was wrong, because instead of backing down, he lawyered up, and that was when everything started to escalate in a way that felt less like a property dispute and more like a slow collision between two completely different versions of reality. And I still didn't know which one was going to break first. I didn't sleep much after that first inspection from the county, not because I didn't trust the system, but because once you've seen water reduced to a fraction of what it should be, you start thinking about everything in terms of timing. Every hour matters. Every delay has a cost you can actually see walking around your pasture. The violation notice went out, and for a brief moment I thought maybe that would be enough. Maybe Daniel and Marissa would just adjust, open things up, fix what they had done upstream, and we'd all move on like reasonable people eventually do when reality gets involved. That didn't happen. Instead, I started seeing activity on their property, trucks coming in early mornings, equipment moving dirt, not fixing the dam, but reinforcing it, like they had decided the notice wasn't a correction, it was just noise. I remember standing at my fence line one afternoon watching the dust rise above the tree line upstream and feeling something shift in me. Not anger exactly, more like that slow realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a choice they were continuing to make. Down in my pasture, the cattle were already reacting, slower, restless, pushing toward the creek even though there was barely anything left in it. Just shallow stretches of water that looked more like leftovers than a living stream, and I had never seen them like that before, not in all the years I'd worked that land. A few days later, I went back up there again, this time not to argue, just to see with my own eyes what kind of thinking led to this. And I found Daniel standing with a small group near the edge of the pond they were forming, talking to an environmental consultant who was pointing at drawings and calling it habitat expansion and water retention strategy. Words that sounded clean and organized but didn't match what I was seeing on the ground. When I stepped in and confronted him, he didn't act surprised, almost like he had been expecting it, and I told him again, clearly, "You are interrupting a senior water right. This creek runs through my land, and you cannot hold it back like this." And he just nodded slightly and said they were working within reasonable ecological parameters, that it wasn't stopping the flow, just modulating it. That word stuck with me, modulating, like the water was a signal instead of survival. I told him that water rights don't care about interpretations, they care about priority dates. And that's when he finally showed a bit of frustration and said something like, "It's part of a shared system now." And that told me everything I needed to know about how differently we were looking at the same creek, because to me it was obligation and history, and to him, it was design. The county water master Harold came out again after that, this time with inspectors and proper measuring equipment. And they didn't just look at the dam, they documented everything: flow reduction, structural impact, downstream conditions. Every detail that would later matter if this escalated further, and when Harold finished, he didn't sugarcoat it. He just said plainly that if the structure stayed, it would move into formal enforcement and court action, no more warnings after that point. That night I called Rebecca Mallory, an attorney who had dealt with water disputes across the state for years, and I laid everything out for her, expecting questions or hesitation. But she was direct from the start. She asked for the water rights certificate, the inspection report, the dates, and within minutes she said this was exactly what it looked like, a clear interference with a senior right. And courts in dry regions don't take that lightly. She filed for an emergency injunction immediately. While that was moving forward, things on the ground kept getting worse in ways that didn't feel dramatic, just steady, like pressure building in a system that wasn't designed for it. And I had to start hauling water into tanks just to keep the herd stable, something I had never needed to do before, something that felt wrong every time I did it because it meant I was compensating for something I already legally should have had. Daniel acted like none of it was urgent, still waving sometimes when I drove by like we were just neighbors with different landscaping preferences instead of two people locked into a legal and environmental conflict that was now affecting livestock survival. When the court hearing finally happened, it took place in a small rural courthouse that smelled like paper and old wood. and Judge Eleanor Grant presided. Someone who actually understood ranch life in a way that made her questions sharper than any lawyer's argument. Daniel's side tried to frame it as ecological restoration, wetlands improvement, long-term environmental benefit, but Rebecca kept bringing it back to the basics. Senior rights established in 1952, measurable reduction in flow, direct downstream harm, nothing abstract. The judge didn't interrupt much, just reviewed the documents, looked at the maps, listened to both sides, and when she finally spoke, it was clear she wasn't interested in interpretations, only facts. She ruled that the dam constituted an unlawful obstruction of a senior water right and ordered it removed within 21 days, or authorized the plaintiff to have it removed at the defendant's expense. I remember walking out of that courthouse thinking that was it, that the system had done its job, but Daniel didn't look like someone who had accepted a decision. He looked like someone who had just been given a countdown, and that's exactly how he treated it. The days after that moved slowly. The dam stayed in place. The creek stayed reduced, and the sense of tension just kept building without anything visibly changing, like the land itself was waiting for the final decision to actually be carried out. By the end of those 21 days, nothing had been fixed. And that's when I realized we weren't dealing with confusion anymore. We were dealing with refusal. The morning I went back up there, I didn't bring anything dramatic with me at first, just my truck, my operator Tony, and a copy of the court order sitting on the dashboard like a quiet reminder that this wasn't improvisation anymore. It was execution of a decision already made somewhere else by a judge who had actually looked at the facts instead of the story around them. The air felt different that day, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with weather, more like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which version of reality was going to win, the one on paper or the one built out of dirt and defiance. When we pulled up near the dam, Daniel and Marissa were already there, like they had been waiting, and for the first time I saw something in Daniel's face that wasn't confidence or calm. It was that thin layer of frustration people get when they realize time didn't solve their problem the way they expected it to. My attorney Rebecca arrived a few minutes later, clipboard in hand, calm as ever, and even Harold the watermaster showed up with one of his field inspectors. And that's when it really shifted from a personal conflict into something official, almost ceremonial, like the land itself was being returned to order in front of witnesses. Tony started the machine without much ceremony. No speeches, no theatrics, just the low rumble of hydraulics as the excavator moved forward toward the earthen wall that had been choking the creek for weeks. I remember Daniel shouting something about environmental destruction, about habitat loss, about consequences, but it sounded distant, almost like he was still trying to argue a case that had already been decided somewhere else. The first bite of the bucket hit the top of the dam, and the soil gave way easier than I expected, like it had been waiting for this moment too. And once it started collapsing, it didn't stop. It just folded inward in slow motion until suddenly it wasn't a structure anymore. It was just earth returning to where it had come from. And then the water came. At first, just a thin break through the debris, then a rush, then a full release like something that had been holding its breath for too long finally exhaled, spilling down the natural channel and cutting through the dry creek bed with a force that made everyone go quiet for a second. I didn't feel victorious in that moment. Not really. It felt more like relief mixed with exhaustion, like watching something heal that you didn't realize had been slowly dying in front of you. Marissa started crying, saying they had built a habitat, that we had destroyed it, and I won't lie, there was a part of me that understood her emotion even if I didn't agree with her conclusion, because from her perspective, she had created something intentional, and from mine, she had interrupted something essential. Daniel walked over to me holding the court order like it was something he still didn't fully accept, and I just told him quietly, "You had the chance to fix it before it got here," and I meant it without anger at that point, just fact. What came after was almost predictable in hindsight, but at the time it still felt like another layer of disbelief. Daniel tried to sue me for damages to his pond, claimed loss of investment, ecological harm, all of it, but Judge Grant dismissed it in minutes, basically stating that you cannot claim damages from the removal of an unlawful obstruction you built yourself, and on top of that she ordered him to reimburse my costs, including the water hauling expenses I had been forced to cover just to keep my herd alive, which honestly felt like the only moment in all of this where the system actually balanced itself properly. Harold's office also recovered inspection and enforcement costs, And for a brief moment, everything felt settled in that very legal, very final way courts like to pretend is the end of a story. But it didn't stop there, because Daniel then escalated it one more time, filing complaints with the state environmental agency, trying to reframe the entire situation as environmental damage rather than unlawful obstruction. And that's where things finally stopped going his way completely. The state investigation was short, almost procedural. They reviewed permits, saw none existed, reviewed impact reports, saw violations, and within weeks they issued their own penalty, a fine for unauthorized dam construction and a formal order requiring full restoration of the creek channel with a prohibition on rebuilding any similar structure. I remember hearing that part and thinking how strange it is that something so emotional in real life ends up becoming something so administrative on paper, like grief and anger get translated into forms and fines and compliance deadlines. After that, I would sometimes drive down to the creek in the early mornings just to check on it, and it looked like it used to, not perfect, not untouched, but moving again, alive again, doing what it had always done long before any of us decided we had ideas about improving it. Daniel and Marissa eventually stopped trying to engage with me directly. I think they realized there wasn't another angle left to argue, and I don't know what they ended up doing with that property. Maybe they stayed. Maybe they left. Honestly, I never asked because at a certain point knowing more doesn't really change anything. What stayed with me wasn't the legal win or the conflict or even the dam itself. It was how quickly two versions of doing the right thing can collide and turn into something neither side recognizes as right anymore until it's already too late to undo cleanly. And I still think about that sometimes, because out here land doesn't care about intentions, it only responds to what you actually do to it, and the law, well, the law just tries to catch up afterward. If you've ever been in a situation where someone genuinely believed they were improving something while you were watching it fall apart, I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments who you think was right here, because I don't think this story is as simple as people want it to be, and maybe that's the part nobody likes to admit.